This podcast is brought to you by Knowledge at Wharton. Please visit knowledge.wharton.upenn.edu for more information.
That's the part of the calculus that's very unclear at this point. And neither candidate has a very clear plan on it. They both are basically appealing to the vague language of we'll find the inefficiencies somewhere in the budget and we'll cut those things out. But one person's efficiency is another person's subsidy, and so it's very hard to find those things. And so what you say before the election, what actually happens after the election, are often two very different things. I think the best way of trying to answer that question is to look at track record. And in particular, McCain's plan will cause probably a little larger deficit than Obama's. Not so much, but McCain also does have more of a track record of voting against government spending, trying to cut government spending. In fact, one example is that he actually voted against Medicare Part D, which is quite remarkable given that he comes from Arizona, the second most aged state. And he's actually never lobbied or put in a bill a single earmark during his entire career. And so I think he has more of a track record of cutting spending. On the other hand, Obama has the advantage of being a Democrat. So when it actually comes to cutting spending, he'll actually be maybe trusted more with that. And so I think at the same time, his track record, his short track record, is not as compelling. He's had lobbied for earmarks for his district, and he's never been kind of a cutter in terms of government spending. And so on one hand, you have McCain with kind of the track record of cutting, who will have a harder time as a Republican doing it. And on the other hand, you have Obama, who would probably more naturally trust as a Democrat to do it, but doesn't have the track record. So the theorem, what's called divided government, can suggest both ways. In particular, on one hand, having a divided government, the idea is that it's supposed to just constantly be constant roadblocks. It's very hard to get increases in government spending because it's hard to get a bill through Congress that's actually going to be signed by the president and so forth. But when it actually comes to cutting spending, it may be actually to Obama's advantage because he does have a cooperative party, and so he has to kind of get them on board and use the power of the White House for that. So again, I think politically it's going to be a little bit easier on Obama. The problem is that he doesn't have the maverick track record that McCain has. There's no question that tax code is a perfect place for thinking about distribution, equity, and efficiency in terms of economic growth. In fact, it's the key area. At the same time, I think Obama's side, they really want to focus on what we call the deltas. That is, they want to look at past tax changes and say lots of those accrued to the rich, and therefore we want to reverse those. Whereas what they don't report as much is what we call the levels, actually reporting what is the actual distribution of the tax burden between middle class and rich. And so what they do is they are in some ways exploiting a misconception. And that misconception is that most Americans believe is that the middle class pays the taxes. It's not true. The top 10% of income earners pay majority of the taxes. It used to be true before the 1986 Tax Reform Act. But the 1986 Tax Reform Act really closed down lots of loopholes and so forth. Today, the rich pay actually most of the taxes. And so when we think about what's the ideal tax system, we shouldn't just look at how a tax plan impacts one group versus the other group. What we should actually look at is the resulting state. How much taxes do we want levied on the rich versus the poor? And presumably we want a higher tax rate on the rich than on the poor for equity reasons. But for efficiency reasons, we don't want the tax rates to go so high on the rich. They are, in fact, many of the job creators. And so we want to have that type of trade-off. But we shouldn't just look at the changes. What we should actually look is the resulting levels that a particular tax change. And the fact of the matter is the McCain plan will actually result, again, in the top 10% of the income earners paying most of the taxes. That's not going to change under either plan. But this is a part of the rhetoric that's very confusing to people. Technically, these tax cuts do sunset in 2011. And so by extending them, is that a tax cut or not? There's a huge debate about language. I think it's irrelevant. And the reason why it's irrelevant is because I don't think the right focus should be on what's the impact of the change on each particular group. What I think the right analysis should be is what is the resulting end? That is, what is the level of taxes that we should expect to have from high income earners versus middle versus low? And so, to give you a simple example, if I told you that the top 10% paid 90% of the taxes, well, if you cut taxes, most of the tax cuts are going to accrue to the top 10%, just pure math. And so that's not therefore a regressive tax cut. It's just attributing, it's just a natural result of the original level. Well, the top 10% actually pay about 65%, depending on which year that you look at.
Of the total
income tax revenue. They pay, in some years it's even higher than that, in the 70s. And so, what we really should ask ourselves from a distribution perspective is that the type of allocation that we like? And so when we cut taxes across the board, yeah, lots of it's going to accrue to them. That's only because they're paying a lot of taxes to begin with. And so that's why it's not fair, I think, to look at the change. It's what you really want to look at is kind of the actual resulting level that you end up with. And also in terms of efficiency, that is production in the economy, you don't care about the change impact. What you care about is the resulting level. And so that's where the McCain and Obama plans are going to differ a fair amount. And partly it depends on how you interpret the Obama fix of the Social Security tax. And that is, he's been unclear. He said one thing where he basically said he wants to lift the cap on Social Security taxes. That would result in a dramatic increase in marginal tax rates of higher income people. His advisors, however, say he's not actually going to propose that. He just wants to have a tax surcharge on the higher income people. Well, the difference between those two things, the one he eventually comes out with, could have a dramatic impact. The deficit certainly matters for each plan, but at the same time, I think the distribution of the taxes do matter. I mean, I think my own opinion is that we do want a progressive tax system. The question is, how much do you really want to hit the higher income people versus middle income and lower income? And again, most Americans really believe that the middle income people pay the taxes, and
even though it's not true.
It is not actually true. It is, most of the taxes are actually paid by the rich. And when I told my middle income class friends, including I consider myself fairly middle income class, they don't want to believe it. They say I'm definitely wrong, but the data is pretty clear. Oh, and those numbers don't even tell a small portion of the truth, because they rely simply on this, in my opinion, fraudulent government accounting scheme, which ignores how much we're accruing in the big entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, and so forth. I once testified before Congress that if they did this type of accounting in the private sector, the CEOs would go to jail. It would actually be illegal. Basically, I've done my own calculations, and if you actually brought in the increase in liabilities in Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, the entire government liabilities, the true deficit is not in the 450 to 500 range. It's actually about $2.5 trillion, much larger. And that's just the increase in liabilities across all spending minus tax programs. And Medicare is the much bigger problem. It's actually about this shortfall in the Medicare program is about 6 times larger than Social Security, and it's also a harder problem to fix. With Social Security, there's actually some easy fixes. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like it's without pain, but the Bush administration and McCain have talked about scaling back benefits for higher income earners by scaling back some of the dollar benefits, having those grow just with inflation and not faster than inflation. For lower income, actually have them grow faster than inflation, so it tilts and makes it more progressive. That type of change alone could go a long way to solving the Social Security problem. Medicare, very difficult problem to solve. Not only is the shortfall 6 times larger, but how do you cut it? That is, do you say, well, we'll pay for half the operation? It's not a dollar benefit, it's an in-kind benefit.
Right.
And so it's much harder to cut that type of program, because now the government's in a position where they have to start saying, you know, we'll pay for that type of surgery, but not this type of surgery.
Right.
It involves very tough moral decisions. So what happened with Medicare Part D, it's the first real attempt, and Part D pays for prescription drugs. It's the very first attempt to get some type of income or what's called means testing into the system.
Right.
That's going to be a very natural way to go with the other parts, and mainly parts A and B that pays for hospitalization and outpatient services. At the same time, it's going to be very difficult to tell some higher income people that, gee, with something that you were getting before is not going to happen. And to keep in mind is that you don't just have to hit high income people. It's a lot of people who don't see themselves as high income who would actually get hit by this. To make a dramatic point, to balance Medicare and Social Security going out into the future, we would have to immediately cut benefits by over 50% in both of the programs to create balance. That's how much we're overspending in present value. And that's immediately. No one's proposing that. No one's going to cut your grandma's Medicare benefit immediately. So if you delay it 20 or 30 years, you phase it in, it's even more dramatic cuts that are needed. And most of that is due to Medicare. And so these are very dramatic changes that are going to have to happen. If they don't happen, we're going to have to raise more money through taxes. That's going to slow economic growth. Or we're going to just have a serious day of reckoning. I mean, people talk about the type of things that happen in the Asian currency crisis and Latin America debt crisis, that those things couldn't happen in America. Well, that's what they thought in those countries too. It can happen in America.
For more information, please visit knowledge.wharton.upenn.edu.